School for Environmental Sciences. He received his PhD from the University of Kansas in 1980 and has been at Guelph since 1982. He has also been acting director of the Arboretum on 2 occasions. Gard is well known among honeybee researchers through his research over many years on ecology and behavior of honeybees in North America, Africanized bees in South America, and several species of Asian honeybees. When honeybee tracheal mites were first discovered in the USA in 1985, he and his colleagues conducted research that eventually led to a colony selection method that eliminated this pest as a problem in Ontario. It was Gard's profound love of bees, coupled with the potential of beekeeping to improve the lives of rural poor people, that led him to initiate an apiculture project in Vietnam in 2006, funded by CEDA through its University Partnerships in Cooperation and Development Program. With this initiative, Gard built upon previous experiences in beekeeping development in Central America and Indonesia. The result was a project that succeeded on multiple levels. As a part of the strength of that success was broad appreciation of the socio-cultural environment within Vietnam. Today, Gard will discuss this beekeeping and training project in Vietnam and some of the development learning that occurred while implementing it. Thank you, Gard. Welcome.
If any of you know me, you could probably sense some of my words coming through in that. Got a little blurb there. Just as kind of a funny aside, you know, I don't know if you ever noticed, the busier you get, it seems like the more things go wrong. And so yesterday my computer was freezing up for no good reason whatsoever. Well, this morning I had an omen that it might not be such a great day. I got on the scale to weigh myself. I'm trying to gradually lose some weight, not going at it really fast, and the scale came back reading error. So that was my first thing this morning when I got up. Fortunately, the rest of the day's gone pretty well, and here we are. So we have a small group today, and I know it's fairly diverse. I'm going to ramble along fairly quickly, but please, if you have something as I go along that you want to ask me about or stop me, wave your hands and just let me know, because part of the reason this Vietnam thing succeeded was we got away from straight lecturing of people to more interactive and hands-on learning, and I strive to do that here in my teaching as much as I can. It's not easy, but I strive to do it as best I can. And there is, yes, Karen Houle. I love Karen because she took my apiculture class in 1988, I believe it was, and after 40 minutes into a lecture on the sex discrimination of bees, how sex works, how you get males and females, her hand shoots up and she says, I'm going to embarrass her.
Very embarrassing.
I didn't understand a thing you just said. And I looked around, I asked, how many of you understood this lecture? Or didn't understand it? Everybody's hands went up. It's like, okay, next lecture we'll come back at this and go ahead and again. So I've always appreciated her frankness and her openness at being outspoken and keeping people on track. So keep me on track if I go astray today. Okay, so the talk is about what we did in Vietnam, but part of it is background. And it'll lead into how I got involved in beekeeping development projects. As a biologist, that's not an instantaneous leap. And then go on and look at some of the aspects of the project we had in Vietnam. And what I'm trying to get across, and part of it is, well, I guess part of it is why so many projects fail, and part of it is why this project, I felt, didn't fail. I thought it was quite successful. So, and success, of course, can be measured in many different ways. We'll talk a little bit about that, but you might have questions at the end to flesh that out. So, and I've got this fancy thing now, like this. I can go over here and go like this. Look at that. Isn't that nice? I've never used this before. So if you were to go to Africa 100 years ago, or even today, if you went to many parts of Africa and you asked about honeybees, or you were traveling across looking for the elephants and the lions, you would come across trees like this with beehives hanging in the trees. And the immediate question that goes through our minds, given the way we keep bees, is, why don't they bring them down and work with them where you can easily work with them, where you can do things with them? Why would you work with a log hive when we have so much better technology available to us today? It was 150 years ago, more than that, when good old Reverend Langstroth had his eureka moment one day and realized that he had come up with the solution for how you can make a movable frame hive. And there he is, the picture in his book the next year when he published this and promoted it across North America. It spread very, very quickly. So 1851, he came up with his hive, and within 5 or 10 years, virtually everybody keeping bees in Europe and North America, if they had the money and they could buy beehives and so forth, had switched over to these much more manageable hives of bees. And we'll see pictures of both log hives and movable frame hives like this, so you'll start to see what I'm talking about. So what's that led to today? It's led to modern beekeeping. Here you have 4 hives on a pallet. The pallets are lifted by a forklift. They're transported from the middle of the United States to California. Here they are sitting in the winter waiting for the almonds to start to bloom, which is going to happen any day now. There's about 1 million colonies of bees in North America going to California for almond pollination, and they're just going to barely have enough bees. Everybody's heard about colonies collapsing, and every year I think this is the year the almond growers won't have enough. And every year they just squeak by. But that's what we think of now as modern beekeeping. You see a whole bunch of beehives sitting in some farmer's field, and they may not be on pallets, but nice little boxes, they look like that.
Just a question about the population of honeybees throughout the world. Is it in decline?
There is a little bit of controversy over that, yeah. There was a paper by a guy in Calgary and a few of his associates just a few years ago that said they're not. And then a whole bunch of people came right back out and said, yes, they are. And I think it depends on how you measure it and how do you get the data. It's very difficult. We can get pretty good data out of North America or Europe, but the rest of the world, I think it's pretty sketchy. But there's no doubt that in North America and Europe, bees are in big trouble. So here is what many people then think of as perfect beekeeping. Here's the scenario. Beekeeper goes off on vacation. In this case, it looks like they're in Jamaica, perhaps. And they see a couple of beehives. Maybe they see those bees in Africa hanging in a tree, and they think, oh, I'm a beekeeper. I know about bees. I know how to manage bees. I get a pretty good crop of honey. I make money out of it. Maybe not a huge amount, but I make some money every year. And these people could be making money from bees. It could be helping their livelihood. They could be improving so many aspects of their life. So that beekeeper then gets interested in international development. And they don't have any background in the theory of development. They don't have any experience in development. They're really, quite honestly, completely over their head. And yet there's this drive, this immediate drive to do something good and to improve the situation. And it happens over and over and over again. And we'll talk about it a little bit, but sort of to lead you to where I'm going, the problem then becomes that we only know about our beekeeping, for example, here in Canada, and when I go to Jamaica or when I go to the plains of Africa, do I really know much of anything about the people there, the environment, the seasonality? I know almost nothing, and yet there's this immediate belief that bees and beekeeping is going to help. And lo and behold, often it doesn't, because you've missed some piece in the puzzle that was important. So, if you were to go to parts of Africa, they now have this modified beehive you see here. It's still hanging, and it's got a little structure there to keep it shaded so it won't get too hot during most of the day. But there's still a lot of wood in there. It's got a pretty fancy cover. It looks like it's made of metal. And places in the world, that hive would be completely out of reach in terms of being able to afford it for the local farmer and with the kind of limited funds that they have. But a project comes along, it's going to pay for it. Well, you can afford it for a while, right? So that might be modern beekeeping. Is it modern because it's still being done today? Does that make something modern if it's being done today? I don't know. I have a colleague I'm working on something with who hates the term traditional and modern beekeeping because she thinks they're such loaded terms. And just because it's traditional doesn't mean it's appropriate. Just because it's modern doesn't mean it's appropriate. So those words are really loaded. And here's another picture taken, and I pulled it off the web, from, I believe it's Uganda. And those are some kind of, they're either logs or even potentially woven hives. Is that modern beekeeping? Why would you choose to keep bees like that when we have these great hives? Well, part of the reason is, if you're in Africa, you might put the bees are very migratory. And you might put some hives out to try to catch swarms of bees, and maybe out of the 30 hives you put out, maybe only 7 or 10 of them get bees in them. Well, if I'm using a great big expensive hive like we have here in North America, those double box hives that you see, just the hive itself is going to cost you well over $100. Now, if I'm suddenly going to try to have a bunch of beehives in Africa, and I want to put out 30 boxes to catch, hopefully catch 10, I got to have $3,000. Well, there are an awful lot of Africans that you mentioned $100 and they're walking out the door. Like, that's beyond the pale of what kind of money might be available to them. So we could invest in it for them. That's great. But then when we walk away and there's no more investment of money, are they going to be left with enough infrastructure and enough knowledge and enough techniques that they can carry on? So we have this low occupancy rate. We need really cheap hives. Whoops, I'm hitting the wrong. See my great little device here. Works great if I hit the right button. We need really cheap hives if there's a low occupancy rate. If you put them up in the trees, you get away from those honey badgers. Anybody watch that little video, Honey Badgers Don't Care? Yeah, those are nasty animals, nasty. They got safari ants on the ground that are sort of like army ants that will wipe out beehives if they're sitting on the ground. They aren't going to get up in the tree. Those fancy hives, Langstroth was the guy who invented the modern hive we use. So if there's an awful lot of fancy stuff going on in there. To make those frames, there's all these fancy cuts. You need a power saw. Well, if you don't have a power saw, how are you going to make a Langstroth hive? So you can jury rig it. You can do something simpler, but those Langstroth hives are out of reach. And then you just there I go again. There is the whole thing of local tradition. How do I normally keep bees? Am I going to leap to something that's completely different than I've done before? Perhaps, if you experience it long enough and you see it works, but in many cases it'll just be rejected because it's just too strange and too foreign. And there are many other reasons, but that's why those log hives are up in the trees. They work. They're cheap. You can put a lot of them out. You can catch lots of bees. If the bees go away, it isn't a big deal. Honey badger don't care, neither do I. So here's an example. I just told a picture. It's a random picture. I don't know the people in it, so I'm not trying to slur against this guy. But is this project going to succeed? I doubt it, personally. Because this hive right here, look at the wood investment and the cutting and stuff that was needed to make that hive. You could probably cut those pieces with a handsaw, but it's still a lot of wood. Wood is often very expensive. This lovely little hive tool that this guy's brought down, well, that's going to be $5 or $7. They're not going to be able to afford that. They've got to have all this equipment. They've got these fancy gloves. And if you teach them that you need these gloves to work the bees, what happens when you walk away and they're going to do it on their own? Can't get the gloves, can't keep bees. It's that simple. Can't keep the bees. So there are many, many, many projects involved with bees, good and well-intended, that just don't work. I would say that probably 9 out of 10 fail for various reasons. And there are many, many reasons why bee projects can fail. The project I'm going to tell you about, we actually got really lucky on a couple things. Things I had not thought about or that we hadn't dealt with, and the chips fell in our favor, so we were lucky and we didn't have to worry about it. So there's my background. There I am in 1975, probably, in the savannas of French Guiana in northern South America, starting to understand killer bees, these African bees that were brought to North America. So I literally cut my teeth working with those bees. But as a biologist, my idea of taking photos was if I'm in Vietnam, or sorry, if I'm in Panama or if I'm in French Guiana, I took about 5 pictures of myself and everything else was flowers, trees, bees. I didn't have a good lens for birds. But I didn't like people. I liked biology. I avoided people. I was not a people person. Development was not in my bloodstream at all. It was a stretch. So what happens? Well, my predecessor at Guelph, Gard had gotten involved in some projects. He had gotten into his mid-50s, around 55, 52, and for various reasons decided he wanted to get involved in some beekeeping development. And like these other stories, he had no experience with development. Development just means you go in, you teach them what works. And fortunately, he was smart enough that he didn't use the hive that I've been showing you. He did use a simpler hive. Still a lot of wood in it, but it was a simpler hive that they could make themselves. But it struck me after I'd been at Guelph, after he had retired, and I'd been here 4 or 5 years, we'd get visitors that would show up from Kenya, where they had this big lab working on honeybees, and they had people who'd been trained and everything. And they would say, do you have any information about keeping bees? And I'd say, well, there's a center in Karen, and right outside Nairobi, where they work with bees. And they're like, well, we live right next to Karen. We don't know about this. My sense is that very little got left afterwards that carried on to help train people after the fact. And I think it was just that there was too big a rift, or too big a gulf between what was needed there locally and what was being promoted by the project. So that's my background. I came from there, and I was hired here. 50% of my time was to do international development, without having ever learned anything at all about international. How many of you are international development things? Yeah, does this sound like stupid? Yes. It sounds really stupid, and it was I guess the era in part. I guess the idea was that, well, if you knew science and you knew bees, you could clearly teach people how to do that. So these are not so important, but the whole idea is here that I had various types of projects working on biology of bees, because I'm mostly a biologist. But then there were these 2 first little projects in Panama that tried to help them deal with the arrival of African bees as they were moving northward. I got interested in Asia, spent part of about 6 months of '89 in my first sabbatical based in Malaysia and experiencing bees in that part of the world. I rediscovered a species of bee right here on the island of Sulawesi, and in order to be able to get the money to study it, I basically sold my devil to the international development. Sold my soul, sorry, to the internet. So yeah, I haven't sold my devil. I didn't. I should do that. I get rid of it, whatever it is. Sold my soul to the development devil, and it did not help my project. The fact that I had a personal interest in being there that was separate from helping people with beekeeping development. We had many, many problems with these projects. I won't go into them. But in this project in Indonesia, the guy who knew about bees was in the south. He hired his nephew to manage the bee training, and his nephew had never seen a beehive before he hired him. So you can imagine how well that worked. And fortunately, you'll see there's another kind of bee in Asia that people go honey hunting for, and we knew that, and the honey hunting portion of what we did was very, very successful, which I knew it would be up front, but I couldn't convince the Nature Conservancy we should go in that direction. So eventually then, various projects, you get older, your focus shifts. I became much more of a people person. I became much more interested in what little bit I could do in the world. I guess I realized that I'd had enough experience by this point, realizing that I couldn't just go somewhere and start a project and automatically it would succeed. It was going to be a whole lot more difficult than that. And I had the good luck of meeting some people from Vietnam. I actually met Dr. Chin. I met some of them in '94 at a meeting, and I met him at a workshop in '95. But in '96, they held a similar meeting in Hanoi, and I went and took some time and met the people from the Bee Research and Development Center there, and they were very open. I was totally surprised. We would ask them, there were 3 of us there, a German, an American, and me. This isn't the start of a joke. But there were 3 of us there who were interested in knowing more about what they did. And we were asking really difficult questions, the kind of things you would never ask colleagues here. And they would just answer, like very openly answer. Say I don't know, or say that didn't work, I was astounded by the openness. And I also could see that they had a good core of both research people and trainers that could be built upon. So having made a vow to them in '96 that we would try to get a project together, took a long time, but gradually we worked things through, and we got started on this project that got funded in 2006, ran out of funding last year in 2012, so it was about 6 years. So there were many things I learned that I didn't know going into it that helped the project. So one of them was, well, I already knew that we had a good core of people who I had some trust with. I'd worked with them for 10 years, like not work, but we emailed and we met at meetings and we discussed things. And so we had a relationship that was solid to build upon. It wasn't just somebody I'd never met before, like some of my earliest projects. Well, we knew that they trained a lot of people. They had some other development projects funded by the Belgians and the Germans and the Dutch and some other different countries, and that those had been at least modestly successful. They had established some beekeeping enterprises at a very local level. So what I didn't know was, as we started to learn more about Vietnam, that honey is like gold. It's so valuable. If you get a cold or certain stomach ailments, you might, in the city, you might run to the doctor, but most of the people will run and find honey. Honey is the medicine of choice for those diseases. And the more rural the region the honey comes from, the more forest honey it is, the purer it is. It doesn't matter if it's like a rice paddy and they're spraying it with pesticide. Doesn't matter. It still has the perception that being from that rural place, it's much more valuable than the honey you can buy that's imported from Australia. Or even the honey that's produced closer to Hanoi or via Hanoi that you might buy in Hanoi. So people will drive long distances, 4 or 5 hours, to go find a beekeeper to buy honey. They have a market that seems to be, so far, insatiable. And that is, like, going into it, I didn't really think too much about markets. I'm not a marketing kind of guy. I'm not an economist. But I realized coming out of it that that was huge. That having this almost insatiable appetite for honey was just made our product constantly able to be sold and income generated. They have a long tradition of beekeeping. It hasn't been particularly successful in that they didn't historically produce a lot of honey. But nevertheless, there were people, we met people in the region where we eventually started to work, whose grandfathers had kept bees, and their fathers had kept bees, and they kept bees. So there was some tradition of it. And those people who keep bees and who have honey are generally fairly well respected. They're not, it's a positive thing to be involved with bees. So what did we do? Well, after we decided to jump into bed together and start this project, we had an initial trip over. Well, there were 20 projects received preliminary funding, allowed us to go meet our partners, and then 10 of those got final funding for the full project. So once we had this little bit of money, we went over to Hanoi, the capital in the north. We met with our colleagues there at the Bee Research and Development Center. There are the words at the top, and you'll see the acronym to it, BRDC. What we proposed was that, I actually didn't think they needed this. I already knew they had a track record of training people. So my intent was simply to grease the wheels so that they could get out in the field and do what they already did so well. That was my perception. But we didn't really need to train the trainers, but to get the funding under the mechanism that we were getting it through, we had to show some training of trainers. So it was our expertise from here was supposed to train their trainer type people over there. So we proposed that we would work with them to try to make their training more hands-on, more participatory, both in how they collect information and how they do their teaching. As it turns out, they had almost no experience with this, and it was a darn good thing we built it that way. But as they then were going to learn these methods, then to practice those methods, rather than just do a pseudo practice, we went to this province of Ha Tinh, about 8 hours to 9 hours drive to the south, very rural area, and it's a very poor province, where they would do beekeeper training and basically get their experience with these methods as they went about doing it. We would talk about them, we'd go through training exercises, and then like 6 months later they'd be in these villages doing what we talked about, and we would be there, we being Leo Smits, who was at Guelph University, and myself, and we would be there to guide them in their activities and try to help see how they could improve what they were doing. And then we did an initial survey at the beginning. John Devlin talked about this last fall, if you were there, where we collected background data on their activities and how much money they were making. And then we did a follow-up survey with John and Anita Yap, looking at the year 2011 and what had been different from the early start of the program to then. Any questions? Anybody want to interrupt? This is your chance. Damn, I hit the button, I didn't do my magic. So this is the kind of traditional beekeeping in Vietnam. So traditional beekeeping would be keeping bees in a log hive, where, The combs are just vertically built inside of that log hive. You cannot manipulate them. You can't see in to see what's in them. The only way you can tell what's in those combs is to literally go in with a little knife. He's blowing a little bit of incense smoke on them to disrupt the bees and confuse them a little bit. But you can tell by the fact he's not wearing any veil here that these bees are not particularly defensive. This is definitely in our favor, the same kind of project in Africa. Most of the bees in Africa, the bees would have to be half a kilometer away from the nearest house so they wouldn't sting people. Whereas our people, as you'll see in some of the pictures, the hives are right on the front porch, so they can protect them from getting legs and walking away when the neighbors come to visit. So that's log beekeeping, very, very rudimentary. You get, they measure things in bottles of honey. Bottle is an old liquor bottle, and it's usually pretty close to a kilo, so it equates to about a kilo. They would get 2 or 3 bottles a year of honey from, maybe even 1 bottle. It's not very much from a log hive. The other way you get honey is you go out and you find these big giant honeybees. The bees have been driven away from this with the smoke you see. They've exposed all the concentric rings of brood that the bees are rearing. And up in the upper corner here is where the honey would be. And you drive all the bees away and you cut the honey away. And this big chunk of honey you get from the corner might have 20 or 30 pounds of honey in it. You squeeze it down with your hands, and that's how you produce honey. So the vast majority of the honey being produced before we got there was actually coming from honey hunting, and a very small amount from log hives. So what did we do? Well, as I said, we worked with the trainers to try to help them become more aware of other ways that they can collect information, other ways that they could teach. And so here you just see Leo helping with a couple of these activities. On the left, they were doing a community mapping exercise. When we were looking at moving into a new commune. Commune is, just think of it as a village. Think of it as I guess here would be like a township or something. It's not a commune in the sense that everybody's living together and sharing everything. That's ancient history. It's just a word now that they still use to refer to the little piece of land that has 8,000 to 15,000 people living in it. And within there, there's broken down again. They just divide up the land, and there's a bunch of little hamlets, they call them, which are, again, just little segments of the population that are administrative units. So we would go into a commune, we'd visit the different hamlets, we would have the people there do community mapping exercises. We'd do some exercises to try to learn about their daily activities so that we could get a better sense of what women did during the day, what men did during the day. Was there enough time in the day for beekeeping? If you're so busy with fetching water and rearing the cattle and cutting the corn and hoeing the crops and cooking and bathing and everything else, there's no time left over. You can't really do beekeeping. But they had time. They had a couple hours in the day that they could squeeze things in. On the right here, you see Leo with a group of our trainers where we were doing a group interviewing exercise. So one of those people, I'm not even sure which one there, was the owner of the house who's a beekeeper. And they were working through how you do open-ended type of questioning, not just yes and no answers, but how you actually extract much more information through the way you ask the question. So we worked with them to train them, and then we would turn around and our training team would go off down to Hattin, and in the fall then we would do these, first year we would have an introductory training course that lasted 5 days, and then in the second year they would review some of that information but go on and learn some higher order bee techniques that would help them if they really were getting proficient with beekeeping. And I love this picture, not because it shows you what Vietnam is like. It was a pretty sparse hotel room. Everybody, if you give them 5 rooms, they'll all end up in 1 or 2, usually, by the end of a day or 2. Tom here is totally happy. He's now the head of the extension team. These 2 women turned out to be great trainers. Unfortunately, they both hit the mandatory 55, and they both have been forced to retire. But I think BRDC keeps hiring them on contract when they can. But that's our team. Well, there were a few others, but those are the people we work with. And so here you see Huyen, for example, there in the purple, and they're doing, it looks like a mapping exercise there. Sometimes in these examples, it's really hard to pick the trainer out from the trainees, because if you're really mingling with them and interacting with them, and there isn't a true person directing and teaching, but you're exchanging and you're working together, then the role as an instructor disappears to some extent, and the role of the participants rises. And it was very difficult for these people to get used to the fact they didn't have as much control on what was going to be said, what was going to be taught. Many of you have experienced this, I'm sure. But once they got into the flow of it, they realized it was actually so much easier and so much more fun to teach people at the beehives doing things rather than the way they had been doing it before. So these are pictures actually from the very first training exercise we did in 2007. And it just shows, this is the very first day. We already have everybody out looking at a beehive. This is the instructor here. He was the hardest guy to get onto the, he was the oldest person and the hardest one to flip over to being more participatory. His idea of participatory training was to have everybody take their chairs outside, and he would lecture to them outside as opposed to inside in the room. But we had a hard time getting across to him that wasn't quite what we were trying to do here. But he bought into it, and he tried it, and eventually he too saw that it worked. Here is an example of building a hive. We've got the women here, older women, younger men. They're all working together. We had the same man tell us that women couldn't use a hammer. And then 2 days later they were doing that. So there were perceptions to be broken down as they became comfortable with each other. So what did we achieve? Well, this is just a really quick summary. So when we did the review in 2011, of the 195 so trainees that we had started with, we had 2 that had dropped out. Everybody else was still, at least in some way or another, involved with bees. I think it worked out to about 89% of them had actually sold some honey the year before. So the vast majority of them were keeping bees and still selling some honey. Those people who weren't selling honey, some of them were just giving honey, because you can see here that the honey they gave away on average added up to about $72 per person if you were to take it across all of the participants. Everybody who produced honey gave it away. We didn't even recognize this at first. We were just counting numbers of bottles produced, numbers sold, numbers of beehives sold with bees in them, and so forth. And then we had this one woman who we wanted to find out why some of the women had seemed to be not very successful. They hadn't produced very much honey. But she had produced like 79 bottles of honey, which should have been worth like close to $700 worth of honey. She should have been way above the average for her commune. And then when we interviewed her, she said, oh, well, I give all that honey away. I don't really need the money, so I just give all the honey away. Well, this is all part of the social fabric. And when you don't have a strong social insurance system, when you give honey away, there's kind of the expectation that when I need something, it'll flow the other way. And it's an informal exchange, but it helps to build the glue of the society, if you will, that holds it together. And so having honey, especially if you have it around now, as they're getting ready for their Tet holiday, well, that's a big thing. February 10th, having honey at Tet, oh, it's a big thing. So some of these people will be getting good karma through their gifts of honey.
Question here.
Yep, sorry, question, yeah.
Did you encounter any opposition from the villages, either with the placement of the hives or the acceptance within the home out of fear of the bees?
Okay, so I think I skipped over it in an earlier slide, but when we first went into these hamlets and communes, they had to self-select who was going to participate. So only people who really, everybody has experienced bees. Bees are across the landscape at some low density. And so everybody kind of probably has been stung at some point in time by a bee or a wasp. So there were a few of the people who were afraid of bees and really didn't want to go too close. We had one woman, when we were trying to do some filming at the very end, we went to visit her and learn about her beekeeping. She'd done the training, so she knew nothing. And it turned out everything went to her father, and her father was looking after everything. She was definitely afraid of bees. Now we were trying to get her to open the beehive, and she's kind of like this, like kind of standing as far away as she can, and trying. It's like we finally realized what was happening, and we cut that one and moved on to something. But there isn't any problem with having them by the houses because they know that they're fairly gentle, and once they have just even a little bit of experience, that previous picture here, that one, just by the first morning, these people had already stripped off the veils that we had given them each a veil to wear to protect themselves. They all had gotten rid of them already. They saw that they were not necessary, and they went by the wayside. And again, if I were trying to do this in South America today with African bees or in Africa, trying to do this without a veil would be like digging your grave first and then throwing yourself into the hole. It'd just be like suicide. So very, very lucky that we had gentle bees. Yeah, Karen?
Yeah, the question, Gard, is that the traditional beekeeping was done in a log.
Yeah.
So what made you, what were the steps involved that you got to this point where you were actually using the funds with the frames that came out of that wood?
So we had, you remember my good buddy Chin here, who wanted to haul everybody outside to teach. His opinion was that every log hive should be transferred over into a movable frame hive because they could manage them better, they could make more money. We had long talks with him that we didn't want to do that. That what we wanted to do was give them the exposure. We gave every one of the trainees, we gave them each 2 of these little movable frame hives like you see in that picture right there. And so that was a gift they got. We did give them something. We gave them a veil, and each commune got 2 little honey extractors to spin the honey out. But, and I'm losing track of your question. What was the question?
What was the progression to move to?
Oh, okay, so we gave them these hives, but we never encouraged them to get rid of the log hives. We said, and we actually encouraged them to keep both. We said, keep your log hive, keep your movable frame hive. I've even encouraged them to get away from the movable frame hives where, you can't see it there, where there's a whole wooden frame around the whole comb to one where there's just a piece of wood on the top and the bees just hang their comb from the top. Because that's cheaper and easier to build. And they get away from all the problems that they don't cut the wood the right length and it doesn't fit right. But they didn't really want to go that way, and I didn't push it. But you'll see in one of the videos that they still maintain the log hives, and some of them, the numbers have declined, I think because they realize that, they'll get two bottles of honey in their log hive, and they'll get on average about 10 bottles of honey a year out of that hive right there. They can split them and divide them easily. They also might be selling a hive worth 30 bucks, 60 bucks, 60 bucks for a hive. 30 bucks, $60,000. So they might be making almost 10 bottles of honey would be 80 bucks plus another 30. They could be making $110 a year out of one little hive like that, with very little input cost, maybe 10 bucks worth of sugar at most. We can't even begin to touch that here in North America. I wish I could keep bees and make $100 a hive. I would give this job up and start keeping bees, seriously, because we can't make that kind of money here with all the input costs and maintaining pests and everything else.
So how much does it cost them to build a hive like that? Do they build
The hive itself is about 20 bucks, and they charge the bees 30 bucks.
And do they
So it's fairly expensive, but they know that they're going to get $90 worth of honey instead of like $18 worth of honey by experience. So they do the math very quickly, and they have no trouble investing in more of these hives. After we've given them 2, they're making hives right, left, and center. They want hives.
So they can build their own then?
Yeah, they can make, that's all, they can do it all by hand now, yeah. What else is here? So the number of log hives decreased, probably just because it's easy, they've transferred some over, but some like to keep them. The number of frame hives went from 92 at the beginning. We gave them about 180. Now we're up to 270, but now in the whole commune, 6 communes, there's 1,150 roughly. So they've been propagating beehives, but they've also been selling them. So last year in 2011, they sold or gave away 331 hives, 190 so trainees. About 1.8 per person were sold or given away. And these same 195 people we trained through their relatives and people they sold bees to and so forth, they have trained another 1,400 or so in addition. So this activity now is just spreading like crazy because people realize it's not too hard to make a bit of money. So I got to speed up here. So here we have a brick hive. We're trying to reduce the cost of a hive. 20 bucks is pretty expensive. Believe it or not, they can make a brick hive for about 7. And it doesn't get stolen. If you live near a highway, the brick hive doesn't walk away at night. So some of them really like these. And they're warmer in the winter and a little bit cooler in the summer. So there's been a little bit, they're playing with them. They're trying them out. This particular couple, she got the training. He is helping her. Now, this is very common. She got the training. He's now joined in with her. Sometimes the man gets the training. The woman is joined in. So they tend to work a lot together. It's not a big issue. And you can see how gentle the bees are. Like bees everywhere here, and they're just going about the business. We have innovation happening. This is a log hive that this guy said, well, wait a minute. The bees like to put the honey on top. Why don't I just cut this log hive and make a little thing I can cut out of here, and the bee, I'll put frames in there like the other hive, and the bees will stick all their honey on top, and I can cut it out. And believe it or not, because this is traditional log hive, people will pay more money for honey from a log hive than from the movable frame hive that's standing right next to it, because it's better honey. It's traditional. So he'll get like 12 bucks a bottle out of that honey, instead of 9 or 10. So this is, and I forgot how to do this. This just gives you some example of what what happens in training. Okay, the trainer, I'll just point him out. This is the trainer back here, but you'll see what his role is and how they're going about stuff. Whoops, and that didn't work. Why didn't it work? I don't know how to get the sound up. There we go. So the point of it is, they're all working together, learning, and you'll see pulling it back, interjecting stuff, and guiding them as they throw questions out, or they'll say something wrong. He'll guide them a little bit and move them to the next to help them understand what they're seeing. That was one example. This is one of the community mapping exercises. We were actually doing a workshop with other people who work with honeybees from Vietnamese universities. So this guy's from Ho Chi Minh City, and I can't remember where this guy's from, somewhere in central Vietnam. And then we've got some local villagers, and we've got a trainer over here, Mrs. Zhao, and I think there's another trainer in there somewhere. So they're just starting to build a map of their community, and they're playing it. But the point of this is you can see how quickly they become so interactive in their experience, in their building this map. There they are, all interacting. And then we've got another one here that you can just see how... and the trainer is not in it at all. She's down here. She's really not... They're all doing this themselves now. So this gets them totally... Those of you who are international development, you know all about this. But this gets them totally involved in the process. It helps them to buy in. It helps to build the relationships between the trainers and the trainees. And those relationships are really, really strong. They go, they know all about their kids and all about their health issues. They're really integrated. So, some of you might have seen a little video that was on the university website, a longer featurette. Has been produced by Joe A. Savlich at the back there, who's our spark writer, who went over with me in the spring to do this. And hopefully this will work. So I'm going to do a few segments of this. This is where I get to step back and you can just see what we produce. I don't know how to get that thing off. It's there for a minute.
I've had the opportunity to work with honeybees in about 35 different countries around the world. And as I visit places and I experience their beekeeping and I view what they're doing, I've gradually learned a lot of things that work and a lot of things that don't work. In 1995, I first met some bee researchers from Vietnam, and it became apparent that their level of expertise was quite far above that of most of the other countries in Southeast Asia. And later, when I came to a conference in Vietnam, I met with them and we decided we would try to develop a project together. There were several possible places we could have initiated our training activities with beekeeping. Key among all of them was that there would be a high level of poverty in the area, because beekeeping can be an excellent sideline activity for income generation. It has sort of like the perfect storm of characteristics. It builds here in Vietnam on a tradition of people keeping bees. Honey has a very high value. They can sell the product very easily. The bees are part of the natural environment. The bees that are here in this apiary are pollinating people's fruit trees and a kilometer in all directions from here. Just the whole set of conditions here were extremely favorable for low-scale beekeeping that would be highly profitable.
The people in this area are very eager to learn the new things and eager to try the new thing. And you may know that Hà Tĩnh and Nghệ An is one of the very poor area in Vietnam, but the people really enthusiastic to learn, and also they always want to try their best to change their life.
Thì thực hiện với ông thì là những gia đình tôi rất vất vả, làm ruộng về có đi nhỏ, vừa đau, nên là hôm nay từ quân đông thổ chương khi thay đổi chương trình về nuôi ong hiện nay thì chủ yếu là nhà tôi chỉ làm ruộng thì con cái nó ngoài thì là chúng cái nuôi ong giờ thì thôi không đi làm thuê nữa, mà chỉ ở nhà chăm nuôi ong mà làm 2 sao ruộng. Và chúng khi đã đưa ông về đây nói 2 đứa mà thôi thích thú với ông, để là một đêm thức bao nhiêu lần tôi ra với ông bấy nhiêu. Cái cách là đã.
Thì em đối với gia đình thì em thấy là khi em được chưa làm áo á, thì cái nguồn thu nhập của em là ít hơn.
Sorry, I was just going to say that guy that we saw a minute ago who goes out and visits his bees at night, he had no experience going into this. He had never had bees. He received the 2 hives of bees in 2008 in November. And so he had the rest of 2008, 9, and 10 to learn about bees, and then we did an evaluation of his activities in 2011. In that year, he made over $1,000 from his beekeeping, which for them, family income could easily be $1,500 a year, and he was making $1,000 out of it. So when he said he no longer had to sell his labor, what that means is he was forced for 2 months out of the year, because they didn't have enough money, to work for $1 a day, cutting corn in the fields, hauling firewood, hauling rocks and things like that, just really menial manual labor. And you can imagine for $60, that's like 7 bottles of honey. That's 1 hive right there. Easily you can cover that. So he very quickly no longer had to do that kind of stuff. Can make a huge difference when it works on their income. So this woman, I just interrupted her, but.
Chưa làm được áo thì có cái thu nhập mất á, thì là mình có thu nhập lớn hơn, thì được thu nhập lớn hơn thì trong gia đình thì vẫn là giúp đỡ mẹ tốt hơn. Thì em dùng bán mật ong thì cũng cứ chi tiêu, ví dụ là con học hành thì là có mật ong để biếu cho người thân, rồi chồng vui vẻ hơn nhé, không cần hơn mà lợi giúp đỡ mẹ nhiều, mà vẫn nâng mẹ lên nhiều hơn.
Dạ, tôi có được kia đâu. Nó điện mình còn thôi, mình ngoài cũng có làm gì cả.
Just trying to highlight a couple of things here. So that woman said, and several people said that after they'd gotten involved with beekeeping, that their respect in their family went up because they were now bringing in money that they hadn't been bringing in before. And they're considered more valuable, I guess, for their support to the family. So this segment talks about innovation.
But her concept of the science-based was that we're giving people the knowledge of the bees and the management of the bees that all fits together in a system that's integrated with the seasonality of when it rains and when it's cold and when the bees need to be fed and so forth. Because these people now understand the biology of their bees and they understand what their goals are, they are able to problem solve in ways that is quite remarkable. So we've actually had several people innovate with hive designs or innovate with management systems, for example, to overcome diseases that I've never heard of anybody doing before, and yet they've tried them and they're working, and the ideas behind them are now spreading to their neighbors and others in their beekeeping club. A big difference with this project from many others is that instead of just learning a set of techniques that they apply without really understanding when or why they should do the things they do, these trainees have actually put it all together into a system that they're actually able to innovate and create novel solutions to problems that we never would have thought were possible. Here.
Any questions? Comments? If not, I'll just we're just going to see the tail end of this guy and then I'll go to the next person.
Nếu như mà riêng về cái phương pháp dạy và học này mà đi vào áp dụng vào các nội dung trên các lĩnh vực khác thì hẳn có rất có hiệu quả. Là ở chỗ như thế này, riêng về cái phương pháp dạy và học này là lý thuyết xong là anh ra chia nhỏ chia tổ thảo luận, có nghĩa mọi người đều phải trả lời, ai chưa hiểu thì làm lại. Nhưng ở dự án ông là có như vậy, nhưng các dự án khác là không có. Thì đúng là như thế này. Riêng ngay ban đầu là mình làm cùng là một học viên, thì cùng như bao anh em khác. Thì sau khi mình học viên, mình cảm nhận được cái truyền đạt của người ta như thế nào, thì mình phải từ đó, nếu như mình đứng lên để mà truyền đạt cho người ta, thì mình sẽ rút lại được những cái gọi là cái điểm nhấn để người ta dễ dàng hiểu hơn.
So you can get a sense there of his wording about what the participatory training did, or his understanding of it, was that he's gone from becoming just a trainee to now they have to integrate all this information because they have to work together and answer questions and stuff. They now have to become like the trainers, and they're extending it. He was pretty good. His commune, even though they were in year 2 of the 3-year training sequence and getting the training, they, I think, had the greatest advancements in amount of honey and numbers of beehives. And I think it was part of it was his attitude and the way he dealt with the bee club. It wasn't as top-down as some of the others, but it was more interactive. But he had then been approached by other extension agents from the region to come and train them. And when we heard this, we said, well, this is perfect. We have enough money left in the project, we can do that training. So we actually had him participate with our BRDC trainers when they did the training for 25 extension agents from 25 more communes in the region. And we were able to do a basic training and then a bit of a follow-up about 6 months later before the project ground to a halt. So those guys now, they now see how the bees are kept and they're starting to keep them. They have contacts, they can call if they need help. And so it just continues to spread. And we have just one last segment here, and then this movie's done. I should say that this just got done this week, thanks to Joey, and a little bit of pressure from me. And if you just do a search on beekeeping extension in Vietnam on YouTube, there's 3 videos, 2 little short ones, and this one that's 21 minutes, and it'll come up right away.
Involved. One thing I found remarkable about this project is the breadth of beekeeping activities that have developed here. Most people, when they think of beekeeping, they think of honey, and that's really the way we designed the project. Getting people involved in beekeeping so they could produce honey or more honey than before, and to sell that for a profit. But what's emerged is that probably 80% of the beekeepers also sell bee colonies. In addition to that, quite a few of them have learned how to raise queens very, very successfully. So they raise queens and they actually sell them to other people, or within their own commune and with their friends, they may give them away to other people. Queen rearing is a high-end activity that's technically quite complex, And yet, within each group of 30 people we've trained, we probably have 5 or 6 who are now proficient at raising queens. And we even have now some people who don't even want to produce honey. They just want to produce bees for sale, much like you would find with queen and bee producers in the southern United States, for example. Within the small area, they now have essentially all of the components of a complete industry that I think will allow them to be sustainable with this activity far into the future.
And so there you have it. There you have it. So I think, I don't know if there was anything left here. Yeah, that's the last slide. I'm pretty much done. So there were certain things we didn't understand at all going into it, like marketing, which turned out we didn't have to worry about it, fortunately. We knew the bees were gentle. There were a lot of things we did know. But fortunately, what's emerged from it, as you saw in the last comment, we think that this will be sustainable. We're saying that because it's spreading already on its own so far beyond the original boundaries and intent of what we started. And the only thing that they seem to be missing, they know how to make hives, they know how to catch the bees, they know how to work with the bees, they can divide the colonies, they know how to feed the bees. The only thing, they can extract the honey with a little extractor. Those who get it out who are pretty good at it and start to produce a lot of honey go out and buy their own, which they can buy regionally. Only thing missing was we usually start combs with a sheet of wax. It has the wax, the six-sided comb imprint embedded in it. You've probably seen these candles, rolled up candles that are just a sheet of wax that's been rolled up. Well, it's basically one of those sheets rolled around a wick. So they didn't have a ready source of that there in their communities. They had to rely on it coming in from outside. And because this came through in the evaluation that John did, every commune said we want the machine that will allow us to make the foundation. That's what those sheets are called. And so I had enough money at the end that we bought a machine. It's sitting in a central place where it's protected. A guy from Hanoi who makes foundation for a living went to the community. He trained a couple of people there on how to use it, so they hopefully will not damage it. And in theory, they have the potential to make their own foundation as well. I don't even think they really need foundation, but they seem locked into it in their training right now. Right now, mentally, they need it. So they hopefully will have a source of it. They can get it outside, but they might be able to produce it cheaper. So it's there it is. Thanks.
That's wonderful. Well,
I kept looking at that clock thinking, oh, it's going 17 minutes. I've got lots of time. And then I realized that it's wrong.
that was great, really great, incredible insights, and thank you on many counts.
So, yeah, thank you. John.
You mentioned once the bee club.
Oh, yeah.
Maybe you should just say a few words about
Sure.
the bee club.
So, when we did our first 5-day training, one of the last things we did at the end of the week was form the bee club. And I didn't really like the way this was done at first. It was like, okay, now it's time to form the bee club. You got to elect a president. You got to elect a vice president. And I'm thinking, shouldn't this emerge from within? Shouldn't they want a bee club? And sort of this would be something that would evolve over time. But that isn't the way BRDC does their training. They have a history of forming bee clubs, and so they were going to do that. And in retrospect, what I realized was it was actually a really valuable experience, because people then have a forum to come together every month or 2 months. You always have in the group some people who have kept bees before, who are really getting it right off the bat. They're understanding it pretty quickly. That guy who was able to make over $1,000 now, who had no experience before, he's got it. He understands the bees and how to work with them and how to make it work. But then you have those who really are still struggling. And sometimes I had one woman, Mrs. Mai, I was absolutely convinced that by the next time I came back, she'd have gotten rid of her bees, or they all would have died. And we finally went back for the evaluation, and we visited her, and she's got like 10 hives of bees, and last year she produced 55 bottles of honey and made $500. And I'm like, she got it, she finally got it. But the Bee Club allows them to exchange all this information. If they, sometimes they call Hanoi and get help on their phone, but a lot of times they can solve it regionally. And was there something else you wanted me to say, or is that most of it?
No, good, I just point out that that's a perfect example of building social capital in a project.
So they, it was very helpful. And the reason when they showed Mr. Hua there, the extension agent, and I said, I thought part of the reason their commune was growing in their activity faster than the others was partly the way he conducted their bee club. He was less domineering, more willing to listen to everybody. And some of the others was like, this is how you do eat. You must do it this way. And then you don't learn much when you have to go in that mode.
The extension programs that you've run across for agriculture and beekeeping in your travels, do you find that they're quite in touch with what the local people are doing, or do you find that there's quite maybe a gap that is why they're not being effective?
I'd say there's a wide divergence in very effective to very ineffective. Part of the problem is the educational system, where one, they go through here at university to become an extension agent. They get one lecture on bees in that period of however many, 3 years or whatever they're in school. So do they know anything about bees? Nothing, okay? So if somebody were to come to them for advice, they can't help. One of the things we did, I thought this through. This is one thing I actually did think about. I made the decision that as we went into these communes and we were training the villagers, the extension agent would get the 2 hives of bees, and they'd get the very same training as all the rest of the people. And in probably all the communes, I'd almost say, or at least most of them, some of the more successful beekeepers are the extension agents. They've got a little more experience, a little more education, they can read better, they can solve problems a little bit better, and so they're able, because of that experience, to actually guide the people there, as opposed to like the nephew of the guy that I worked with in Indonesia, who'd never looked at a beehive before. How can he guide anybody on how to keep bees? So yeah, there's a big gap, and lots of extension agents would know nothing.
If there wasn't the same opportunity for financial gain, do you think there would still be the same buy-in from the community based on medicinal and health benefits alone?
No. It would, I think we would have found a smaller percentage of the people still engaged when we went back to evaluate. I think overall we would find a low, partly because of that, but even with those still engaged, producing less honey. Some of the people would still get it, and they would still produce it to give as gifts, to use themselves to make a little bit of money. But right now, it's so lucrative that it's pretty hard to turn away from. And they can keep. There's one woman who's she had bees before, so she wasn't a novice, but she became way better at keeping bees as a result of what we brought in. And so she has about 20 beehives right on her front porch. She makes well over $1,000 a year. When we visited her, Joey and I, and we'd missed it the day before, because the day before, a group of guys from Hanoi drove in, and they said, "We want honey now. You must extract the honey now." So they sat there while she spun out the honey, and they gave her $140, and they walked away with 14 bottles of honey. She's getting $10 a bottle for that honey. And $140 just like that. Like, where else in rural Vietnam can you do that? You can't do it. You sell a buffalo, once a year, and you get probably more than that. But and they can manage 20. That's what I was trying to get at. They can manage 20 beehives with a little bit of time at lunchtime and a little bit of time late in the afternoon before dinner, without really interfering with their daily schedule much at all. If they get to 30, 35 hives, they start to have to give some other stuff up. But at 20, they all seem to be able to absorb it into their daily schedule, which again is important. If they were walking 3 hours a day for water, there would be no time left to keep
mix of men and women who were
Yeah, we trained some, but
what sort of percentages, and is?
our goal was 30% women. I think we met 36, so it was about a third.
And is traditionally?
Traditionally, no. If we hadn't mandated it, all the men would have shown up and the women would have stayed away.
No, but sorry, in terms of beekeeping, is that?
It would be men too.
So
But it's not, some places there would be a big cultural taboo against women doing that kind of work. We don't have, obviously we don't have that. It's just more of a, those bees sting and I'm busy at home, so you do that and I'll do this. And then the old ways of keeping it, before they could manage the bees well, the man would have to go to the forest to try to catch swarms of bees. And he might even be overnight up in the forest. So that's not really a woman's activity. But now that they can maintain them and split them and divide them and work with them all at home, it becomes much more manageable. But that's a good question, yeah. And in some cultures, you just couldn't do this at all with women. So when you have projects that go in and they're going to train all women, some of them are misguided right from the outset just because the donor wants to promote women and it's not going to fit with the culture.
What kind of innovations did you find that people were coming up with?
They were little things. We visited one guy he's our one sort of semi-commercial beekeeper. He's now given up a lot of other activities to really focus on bees. And he had a hive that was like extra wide, and what he had done is he had two little chambers at the end that he could stuff with straw, so in the wintertime they would be better insulated and the bees wouldn't be damaged as much. Does it work? I don't know, but he's playing with it. It mentioned the disease control. One of the beekeepers realized that if they just took, when they had a certain disease that wasn't all that serious, but if they just took the queen out for about 2 weeks so that it broke the cycle of rearing the young bees, they could put a queen back in and it would all clean up and they wouldn't have disease anymore. Well, that's like perfect, because a lot of beekeepers are sprinkling little antibiotics in there that, I have issues with. But doing it that way, and nobody told them to do that. They just sort of said, well, why don't we try this? And it worked. So they understand enough about the bees that they're playing with stuff.
Is there anything that you've been able to take back here that would work here?
In terms of their beekeeping techniques, no, probably not. It's two worlds apart, different bees, different culture. But you saw at the very beginning the hanging hive, and I said, is this modern beekeeping? That kind of trough hive, it just has a top bar on top. It's called a top bar hive. There are quite a few beekeepers in North America and Europe who are playing around with those now. They're a little bit simpler, and they claim the bees do better than them. I really don't believe it, but it could be true.
That training program that you used, how was it developed? Was it through BRTC?
So we worked with them. We said, okay, what would you normally do in a training program? They had a 6-day training program, and they told us what the components were. And then I said, well, 1, 6 days is too long. We've got to cut it to 5. And 2, we got to figure out how to convert the things you would stand and lecture to you about into activities that you can do with the bees so that they could. So they learned starting off inspecting a hive, moving frames around. We would take a fairly strong hive, we would show them how to split it into 2. Then the next day we would show them how to combine 2 hives. We'd take the split hive and put it back together. There are times of the year when you would want to combine weak hives. They saw how to feed the bees sugar so that they can get through dearth periods. That's a big problem. They saw how to extract the honey and bottle it. So and they went through, they didn't just see it, but they were doing it like together. So that by the end of that first 5 days, they'd done pretty much everything you would need to do to just maintain some hive speeds.
And how long was the period in between the initial training and the follow-up?
1 year.
1 year?
Yeah, so we go back about a year later, and then we find out, and at the same time in between these trainings and at the time of the second training, our people from BRDC would go, and they would go house to house to house, and they would visit them, and they would look at their hive, and they would see what was happening, and they would talk about what the problems were. So they would be problem solving with them, and then they'd meet with the whole bee club to talk about stuff. So that was, it cost a lot of money, But the net end of it is a lot of people got it as opposed to just being thrown some beehives and a couple years later you got some empty boxes that you use for chicken feed.
So what would you do differently this time? Or if you do it again, how would you do it differently? What would you learn?
Well, we held a honey day, which was to try to increase awareness of bees because we were starting to hear root problems of marketing, of selling honey. I would definitely do that again, but I'd move it up sooner so that the word of honey got out. Because after we had the honey day and those signs that you saw, all of a sudden nobody seemed to have trouble selling honey anymore, and the price seemed to go up all of a sudden, even though there was more and more honey being produced. So we seem to have solved a little bit of a marketing problem very quickly. What else did I do differently?
Could I ask,
Not much.
would you try to get the provincial extension people?
Oh, yeah, that's a good thing. So we, yeah, thank you. We visited the provincial agricultural office right at the very end of this project. And we should have visited them right at the very beginning of the project, because one of the comments was, oh, we've been watching you to see what you're doing. And I thought, oh, that's very interesting. They've been watching us. And they probably literally were. I have somebody who's involved in a project in central Vietnam, and she was trying to solve the problem, and she was starting to think there was a pesticide problem, and all of a sudden she got shut down so fast and was told that that is not what you're here for. You're here to teach how to rear queens, and you do what you're here to do and go home. So they probably were watching us. But we could have probably had greater impact in the region if we'd met with the local officials too. You can never interact enough. That's all I can say. Never interact enough. Well, thanks. And I'll be here briefly. There's some food up here, drink, and if you have any other questions, please ask. But I know it's getting late, so thanks a lot for being here on Friday.